Hello there, everyone, and welcome to the last of the Lost Leviticus studies, as I had called them at the beginning. These are a series of recordings that I believe I lost at some point. This is a few years back, and now that our worship leader Matt the magician, is putting all of these studies on the podcasts, really is the main reason for re-recording these, because these sessions were lost, and nobody was begging for these on YouTube along with the rest of the series. So uh, I'm pretty sure nobody was going to be begging for these either on the podcast, but it is good to have them and have everything in order. So they're being re-recorded, and this is the last of them. This is Leviticus chapter 25, and it's the first part of Leviticus chapter 25, because there is a part 2 and a separate video that we do have. So this will complete Leviticus, and so that's what we're doing here. Let me, before I go any further, let me start my timer here, because I'm trying to pay attention to the amount of time that I'm spending on each of these studies and not going too long, because I can just keep going and going and going. Leviticus 25, this is part 1. And if you're a note taker, you want to take notes, beginning at verse 1 and down to verse 22, I titled Year of Rest. Okay, Year of Rest. And then you'll find out in the second video, I think, but let me tell you anyways, beginning at verse 23 and down to the end, which is verse 55, I titled Year of Restoration. So Year of Rest, and then Year of Restoration. And today we will get Year of Rest, and then Year of Restoration is for the next video, which I know is there because I watched it. But let's take a look here and see what's going on in this Year of Rest. And verses 1 to 7, so I've got the main division as Year of Rest. Verses 1 to 7, I titled Pausing the Planting. Let's find out here what God is instructing them to do. And the Lord spoke to Moses on Mount Sinai, saying, Speak to the children of Israel and say to them. So this is God speaking. God's giving the instructions. Again, these books of Leviticus and Numbers and Deuteronomy, these are all books where you find God instructing his people, but it's not just instruction given. This is from the heart of a father to his small child, who he's raising and doing his best to teach them the right way and the right way to do things. And this is all brand new to them. They've been God's people, but they were not living that way. They were in bondage in Egypt, slavery. And so now they're relearning, essentially, it's like they're relearning how to walk. They're being rehabilitated. And this is all brand new stuff for them. They've been slaves for a few hundred years. And so now they're going to get their own land. And God is instructing them in all of this. So it says in verse 2, Speak to the children of Israel and say to them, When you come into the land which I give you, so these are instructions for the future. Then the land shall keep a Sabbath to the Lord. What is that? What's going on there? 6 years you shall sow your field, and 6 years you shall prune your vineyard and gather its fruit. But in the 7th year, so the Sabbath year, where it says in verse 2 that the land shall keep a Sabbath, this is a reference to the Sabbath day. So there's a day of rest during the week for the Jews that was given to them. In fact, it was part of the 10 Commandments for them. And so they were being commanded to rest. And here, God is explaining that the land needs rest. And so he calls it the Sabbath. The land gets a Sabbath. It's Sabbath rest for the land. And he tells them in verse 3 that they should plant and grow and harvest or prune all of their crops for 6 years. 6 years they should do that. Verse 4, but in the 7th year there shall be a Sabbath of solemn rest for the land. A Sabbath to the Lord. So it's not just that the land gets a year of rest, but it is to be a year of rest for the land specifically dedicated to the Lord. That's what he's saying there in verse 4, a Sabbath to the Lord. You shall neither sow your field nor prune your vineyard. So they were instructed there not to sow or plant, and they were not either, in verse 4, to prune the vineyard. Now, we're going to find out as we continue reading, and as you get into the second portion of chapter 25, which again is the following video, you will find out that you might initially think, well, they're not supposed to plant and they're not supposed to prune their fields. How are they supposed to get food? They were to go to the field and get what was there. But they were not to, when it says not to prune your vineyard, it means don't go empty your vineyard. Just let it grow. Let it grow naturally. And just go out and get what you need. So we'll get to that in another video as you continue to read. But he goes on to say in verse 5, what grows of its own accord of your harvest, you shall not reap. There it is. Don't go and clear it all. Don't reap it. Don't get it all. Nor gather the grapes of your untended vine, for it is a year of rest for the land. So what God is telling them, this is it sounds so crazy, and according to human standards, it probably is crazy. But God's giving them these instructions, and so it's not crazy at all. It's trusting God, which sometimes seems crazy, but it's not crazy. You're putting your trust in a sure thing, and it's not a thing; it's God. But that's what He's telling them here. He's pressing them to do this. He's testing them to do this. It's a year of rest for the land. Verse 6, and the Sabbath produce of the land shall be food for you, your male and female servants, your hired man, and the stranger who dwells with you, for your livestock, and the beasts that are in your land, the animals that are in your land. All its produce shall be for food. Now, before we go any further, let me explain for you. This was a test of their faith. They're being directed here to live by faith for an entire year. Now, God, all throughout the scriptures, from the beginning of, from Genesis, God wanted his people to live by faith. I say that because we oftentimes view the Old Testament and the New Testament differently. We think, well, the New Testament was all about faith. The Old Testament was all about the law. That is absolutely not true. The law was given in the Old Testament, that is true, and the Jews were commanded to live by the law. But that does not cancel out faith. All of these laws were being given to them by an invisible God. The children of Israel early on, they saw signs of this invisible God, but they did not see God. They saw the pillar of smoke, or the pillar of a cloud or pillar of fire. They saw Moses up on the mountain getting the 10 Commandments, and they saw thunder, or they heard thunder, saw lightning, and all of these things. So they saw evidences of God, but they didn't see God face to face, which means that this law that they're getting, Moses is coming down off of the mountain and telling them, hey, I was just up there with God, and God told me to tell you. I mean, think about it. That's suspect. Wait a minute. You're telling me that you were up on the mountain with God, and he told you what? And he told you to. So it was. They had to accept it by faith. Just because it was the law doesn't mean that it canceled out faith. God has always desired for his people to live by faith in him. So here he's giving them another opportunity to live by faith, and that is by working the land for 6 years because they needed to be productive. They needed to do their part. But during the 7th year, there was to be no planting, no clearing of the fields. They weren't supposed to be farming out there. So this means that they had to trust that what they had planted the year before, I mean, all of the plants, everything's out there. They had to trust that God was going to cause those plants to produce enough for them to sustain them for a full year. That's a tremendous test of faith. I cannot say that I would pass that test, but that's what God was wanting from them. This was a test of faith in the Old Testament, in the midst of the law being given. So it's interesting because this is part of their law here. He's saying you need to do this, but at the same time, it's testing their faith, and it would test their faith. And as you can imagine, they failed. As they did, they failed at everything pretty much, just like we do. We fail, in our faith. We may have times and seasons where we're doing well, trusting the Lord, but then there are always times and seasons where we fail, sink like Peter. But as you continue reading through the Old Testament, studying the Old Testament, you will find that God, they cheated God. Remember, it said in verse 4 that this was to be a Sabbath to the Lord. Well, they ripped God off. They didn't do this. There's no record of them ever doing this. So they didn't trust the Lord. They didn't obey him. And they cheated him out of Sabbaths. Not just one, but multiple. And God gets all of those Sabbaths back. He actually sends them into captivity and gets all of those years back. It tells them, this is why I'm doing it. You cheated me. I'm getting back all of my years. So God was serious about this, not just going to let it go. So they were not to plant, and you go, wait, so they were just going to trust the Lord for whatever was there was going to grow. Yes, that's it. That's it. Simple, right? I mean, it's simple to understand, not necessarily simple for us to accept because, we scare easily. So they had to pause the planting. The next thing I said in verses 8 through 13 was that there was the pausing the planting in verses 1 to 7, and then proclaiming the year of Jubilee in verses 8 through 13. Let's see what this is about. And you shall count 7 Sabbaths of years for yourself. So work 6 years, 7th year is a year of rest. Now they're being told you need to count 7 of those Sabbaths of years. So after 7 of those Sabbath years, for yourself, 7 times 7 years, and the time of the seven Sabbaths of years shall be to you 49 years. Right? You understanding? Every 7 years they get a Sabbath. After 7 of those years, so 49 years. Then you shall cause the trumpet of the Jubilee to sound on the 10th day of the 7th month. On the day of atonement, you shall make the trumpet to sound throughout all your land. So that it sound a trumpet. And you shall consecrate the 50th year. So now it's been 49 years. So now we're talking about the 50th year, which would be a Sabbath year. And this is, this is a big deal. This is the 50th anniversary, you might say, I guess, of those 7 years, something like that. You shall consecrate, in verse 10, the 50th year and proclaim liberty, freedom throughout all the land to all its inhabitants. What does this mean? It shall be a jubilee for you. And each of you shall return to his possession, and each of you shall return to his family. In other words, what he's getting at there, beginning in verse 10, was a reset of everything. This is incredible. So every 50 years, if you had sold yourself into servanthood in order to pay off your debt, every 50 years, you're set free. um, or land that had been sold, to somebody else. It goes back to its original owner. This is incredible. So every 50 years is this complete reset. I love it. Verse 11, that 50th year, what does it say here? That 50th year shall be a jubilee to you. In it, so the jubilee was for them, right? To be a blessing to them. In it you shall neither sow nor reap. So again, no sowing or reaping. What grows of its own accord, nor gather the grapes of your untended vine. For it is the jubilee. It shall be holy to you. So this is not just farming. It's not just dirt and crops and food. This is a matter of holiness. He says this is going to be holy to you. You shall eat its produce from the land. So he takes it up a notch when he says this is going to be holy to you. In other words, this is not something to be taken lightly. The Sabbath year was to be honored, or what's the word I'm looking for? It was to be honored for the Lord. Now he says this Jubilee is holy, this 50th year. Verse 12, you shall eat its produce from the field. In this year of Jubilee, each of you shall return to his possession. So incredible. Let's go on and read, and then I'll explain what I want to explain. Verses 14 through 17 I called price control. Okay, so we have pausing the planting in verses 1 to 7, proclaiming the year of Jubilee in verses 8 through 13. So this is a celebratory, this God wants them, blow the trumpets, man. Blow the trumpets and celebrate. And this is holiness. This is a matter of holiness, and do it and enjoy it. Now, he gives them instructions on price control, verses 14 through 17. And if you sell anything to your neighbor or buy from your neighbor's hand, you shall not oppress one another. Don't cheat one another. According to the number of years after the Jubilee, you shall buy from your neighbor. And according to the number of years of crops, he shall sell to you. According to the multitude of years, you shall increase its price. And according to the fewer number of years, you shall diminish its price. For he sells to you according to the number of the years of the crops. Therefore you shall not oppress one another, but you shall fear God, for I am the Lord your God. So what is that all about? After the Jubilee year, and land and money start being exchanged once again, because it's going to happen. You may get your land back, but maybe you still don't have enough money to do all that you want with the land, so you might sell off a portion of it or whatever. But it was important that the price was set according to the number of available years. If I was going to sell you my property and you were going to have it for 50 years, then I could charge you a higher amount, because hey, you're going to be using my land for 50 years. You're going to get a lot of use out of it. But if there was only, a year left, 2 years left on it, it's the 48th year, and I know that in the 50th year I'm going to get my land back, I am not to charge the same amount. The person buying it is only going to get 2 years out of it. So I needed to make sure that I'm not, price gouging. I'm not cheating my brothers, my family. So price control. Now, verses 18 through 22, I titled Provisions for the Seventh Year. So verses 1 to 7, again, I keep repeating this just in case, pausing the planting. 8 through 13, proclaiming the year of Jubilee. 14 through 17, price control. And then in verses 18 through 22, provisions for the seventh year. So you shall observe my statutes and keep my judgments. So God's saying, this is the law, you need to do this and perform them. Verse 18, and you will dwell in the land in safety. So he's telling them, you need to do what I'm telling you to do, and you'll dwell in the land safely. Now, he doesn't say it expressly there, although we know it to be true. And so we can safely say it's certainly intended there. We know what ends up happening. If they disobey God, then they will not live in safety. Then God is going to discipline them. And right now, currently at this time, um, it is early 2025, and on Sunday mornings, we're going through the book of Judges. And the book of Judges is several years after Leviticus. And what we have found is they certainly have not done these things. They are living in disobedience off and on and off and on. And so God repeatedly is disciplining them. He's repeatedly merciful to them. But they didn't dwell in safety. And the reason they didn't dwell in safety is because they disobeyed God. He thus disciplined them, and he disciplined them by using the surrounding armies, enemies, to discipline them. That's how he disciplined them. So they didn't do this. Not a big surprise. If you've been studying the Bible for any length of time, it's not a big surprise. So it says in verse 19, then the land will yield its fruit, and you will eat your fill and dwell there in safety. This is incredible. So God is getting back to what we started with, and he's saying, listen, you're not to sow or reap. You just go out during the Sabbath year, during the Jubilee year. You're to go out and just gather what you need from the field. So they were to just trust God. If they did that, they would dwell in safety. Now, think about this. As long as they obeyed God, they wouldn't have to farm during that entire year. And they would go out and gather just what they needed. And we're told in verse 19, and you will eat your fill. It wasn't going to be scarce or sparse. They weren't going to have, starving children. But you can imagine that's what the people must have thought. Oh man, how can we just not plant? How's God just going to provide for our kids and everybody if we don't plant, if we don't take care of the land? But that's exactly what God was telling them to do. Trust me, and you're going to eat your fill, and you're going to dwell in safety. So it's real easy. Just enjoy your life. Enjoy being, God's child. I'll provide for you. There is a very important illustration here. And that is that as New Testament Christians, God works the same way. He's still working the same way. And we're God's children, and there are things that are required of us. We need to live a life of holiness, cultivate holiness, obedience. Nothing has changed there. Just because it's New Testament doesn't mean that we don't have to live in obedience or holiness, strive for holiness. We do. But there's also this element of trusting God in that he sent Jesus to die for us. Jesus, in obedience to the Father, gave his life on the cross and died for us. And because of that, we now have access to the Father freely through Jesus. There's only one mediator between God and man, the man Christ Jesus. So we have access to God anytime because we've placed our faith in Jesus. We're Christians. We trust that his death was sufficient to pay for my sins. And yet, there are some in the Christian community who still want to live not by grace and the grace of God and the freedom that we have in Jesus, but they want to live by works. And they want to live by the law. And they will try to put a trip on you. And they will say things like, this is just one example, and it's fitting. They'll say, hey man, what day of the week do you go to church? We go, well, we go to church on Sundays. At least here at Revival we do. We go to church on Sundays. And there are people that are Christians that are people that are Seventh-day Adventists, and some people consider them to be a cult or false religion. I'm not here to discuss that right now. I'm just saying that they'll put a trip on you, and they'll say, you're supposed to go to church on Sunday. I mean, on Saturday rather. That's the Sabbath, Saturday. And you know what? I'm okay with going to church on Saturday. That's all right. I don't have a problem with that. I could do that. Um, Sunday too, and we go on Wednesdays, and we have classes throughout the week for different age groups and different ministries. And there's something going on almost every day of the week here at Revival. So, I mean, Saturday, sure, let's throw Saturday in there too. But their point is that if you do not go to church on Saturday, that you're living in disobedience. They make it harder for themselves. They could just read the Bible, study the Bible, understand what's taught there about days and days of worship, and understand that Sunday's a great day, so Saturday, but it's not like the day is required of us in order to be godly or to be holy or to be a Christian. They're making it hard on themselves. Again, back to our Leviticus passage here. In that year, all they had to do was trust God. And they could spend the year working less and enjoying their family time more and still getting enough to eat their fill. You'll be full. But as I've already previously said, these people could not do it. And there are Christians today that still cannot do it. They cannot understand, the idea of just trusting God for their provisions or trusting God, for their holiness. He's for His grace. Trusting God is hard for them. They feel like they have to have an input in order for, God to accept them or to work in them, which is absolutely not true. We are required to live in obedience to the Lord, but that is not. That's not. God is still going to work in our lives. If we're living in disobedience, He's still going to work in our lives by disciplining us, but He's still going to be working in our lives. So there's a good charge here to trust the Lord, to live by faith. Good reminder here in Leviticus 25. It goes on look at verse 20. God, He answers their question before they can even ask it. Verse 20, and if you say, here it is, if you say, what shall we eat in the 7th year, since we shall not sow nor gather in our produce? Verse 21, then I will command my blessing on you in the 6th year, and it will bring forth produce enough for 3 years. And you shall sow in the 8th year and eat old produce until the 9th year, until its produce comes in, you shall eat of the old harvest. Now, some of us hear old produce, and we picture, like old rotten tomatoes or whatever. But that's not what's being said here. God's not feeding His people rotten food. But this is incredible. Verse 20, God says, I've got a plan if you've got a concern. Verse 20, if you say, what shall we eat in the 7th year? This is incredible. Since we shall not sow nor gather in our produce. Verse 21, then I will command my blessing on you in the 6th year, and it will bring forth produce enough for 3 years. Now, what is going on? God says, listen, I understand that you might be scared. This is a scary thing. I get it. But God, being a loving Father, says, I'll tell you what, if you're fearful, what I will do is I will provide enough produce in the 6th year. That's the year before the year of Sabbath or the year of Jubilee. 7th year, they're not to sow or plant or reap. So He says, if you're fearful, what I'll do is I'll give you enough food in the 6th year when you harvest to last you 3 years. In other words, He'll give you enough food to last you the 7th year, But then you won't plant until the 8th year. So he'll provide enough food for that 8th year also. That would be the 2nd year. Yeah, hopefully you're following along. So he'll provide enough at the end of the 6th year to cover you for the entire 7th year. And since you'll start planting in the 8th year and won't have produce for a while, he'll cover you for that 8th year, which would be the 2nd year, right? They wouldn't have produce. And then he'll cover you even into the 9th year. And he says you can eat the old food or the old produce or the old harvest. In other words, I'm going to provide enough. And obviously, it makes sense that they would have to gather that food and preserve it somehow. They didn't have refrigerators, so other ways of drying it out or whatever it would require. But this is incredible because God says, if you're fearful, I get it. God is so understanding. What a patient Father. He's so understanding that he says, I want you to trust me for the 7th year. But if you're having a hard time with that, I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll provide extra. In fact, enough for 3 years at the end of the 6th year. And that way you can go into the 7th year trusting me. You say, hey, we got enough food. Let's just trust the Lord. Let's let him do whatever he wants to. God is so patient. Here in Leviticus, this is one of the reasons why I love going through these Old Testament books. And I mean, it's so rare today. Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. Who does that? We do that. We do that. Here at Revival, here at Fusion, we do that. High school students do that. Why? Because we're learning all of these valuable lessons. God has always been the same yesterday, today, and forever. Always will be the same. He's always worked the same way. He's still working the same way. It's not Old Testament was all the law, New Testament was all the grace. No. He's always worked the same way. He wants us to operate by faith. And when we have a hard time trusting him, he knows that, he understands. And he says, I'm going to prepare a table before you in the presence of your enemies. Psalm 23, verse 5. He prepares a table before me in the presence of my enemies. He knows my enemies are there. He knows that I'll be fearful. But he's already got a plan in the midst of that to settle my heart, to provide for me, to give me peace and protection, prosperity in the midst of that hostile scenario where my enemies are surrounding me. I do not have to fear because God's already prepared a table before me. He prepared, means he did it ahead of time. He already knew that there was an enemy there, but he's already made preparations. What is it? Ephesians chapter 2? Please forgive me. My mind is on Leviticus right now, and then I find it hard to think of other passages, but we are his workmanship, Ephesians 2:10. One of my favorite verses. How could I forget? We are his workmanship, created in Christ Jesus for good works, which God prepared beforehand that we should walk in them. He's already prepared it. What we need to do is learn how to trust him, live by faith. Trust him for our provision, for our protection, peace. And we're going to experience peace when we're trusting him for our protection and our provisions. Then we'll experience that peace. Isn't this incredible? Leviticus. Who would have thought that we would get a lesson on faith from the book of Leviticus? But that is exactly what we just got. So thank you all again so much for tuning in on YouTube and all of the podcasts. If you're listening on Apple or Spotify, or I believe Matt also has them on Amazon, wherever you might be listening, we really appreciate you just tuning in. And if you're at Leviticus 25, then you've probably been listening for a little while, which is an incredible thought. It's like, I think to myself, who in the world wants to listen to me? But it's the word of God that's going out. And so if you're listening, it's probably because you're loving the word of God. And we're doing our best to cover it, the whole counsel of God. And so thank you so much for being a part of that. All right. God bless you all. I hope you enjoy the rest of Leviticus and on into Numbers and Deuteronomy and Joshua and Judges and You just hopefully you continue to just eat it all up. All right. God bless you guys and enjoy.